Hi, the goal of this session is to give you guys an overview of virtualization because you are going to be creating and using virtual machines as part of your lab activity. The reason we're using virtual machines instead of physical computers is, quite honestly, I just don't have that many physical computers for you guys. So using virtual environment lets me have one big server that I subdivide, and each of you gets your own little piece of it to play on. So that's kind of a more normal way things are approached nowadays. You're going to be connecting to your server using Remote Desktop Protocol. Once you log in, you're going to see a screen that looks pretty much like this one. So you may notice that this looks pretty much like Windows 10 and operates very much in the same way. We've just got some extra services available to us. So one of the things I'd like you to note, if we head into File Explorer here, is that we've got a C drive and a D drive. So the C drive, the intent here is it's supposed to be reserved for the operating system, and the D drive is what we're going to use for data. Notice that I already have an ISO folder set up for you guys. That is where I've got copies of DVD images that you're going to need as part of your setup. In order to get started creating the virtual machines, we're going to want to go into Server Manager. And inside of Server Manager, if we go to Tools, we have Hyper-V Manager. So Hyper-V Manager is the utility that we use to create virtual machines. Hyper-V is actually the virtualization product we're using. It's Microsoft's virtualization product, so it's one of the two more popular ones out there. The other virtualization product that's fairly popular is VMware. We're using Hyper-V just because that's what's already set up in my environment, and it was easy for me to get going for you guys. So one of the things I'd like you to note inside of Hyper-V Manager is if I go to this Virtual Switch Manager, I have already set up a network for you guys inside your environment called Internal Network that is completely isolated from everything else. So that's to make sure that the virtual machines that you create, they can connect to this network and talk to each other, but they do not actually talk to another group's virtual machines. So that's the idea behind it. So step one here, let's create a virtual machine. So when we start up the wizard for the new virtual machine, it's going to ask us for a name, and we're going to call this virtual machine server. And I'm going to modify the default path here, and I'm just going to copy that because I'm going to put it in everywhere as we go through. So I like to keep my virtual machines in separate folders so everybody knows what's going on. So I'm going to have a virtual machine named server, and I'm storing it on the D drive in the server folder. I'm going to create a Generation 2 virtual machine. That is just the most modern version of virtual machine. Because we are using Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10 for this lab, that will work just fine for us. So I always choose newer when it's appropriate. In terms of the overall amount of memory, each of the servers you guys are working with only has 8 gigabytes of RAM total, so I'm going to suggest that you give your server 2 gigabytes of RAM and each of your workstations 1 gigabyte of RAM. So I'll do my server here at 2 gigabytes of RAM. For networking, I want to connect it to that internal network that is already up and alive for me. And then for virtual hard disk, for the virtual hard disk, it's creating a virtual hard drive named server. Notice that it's creating a file, server.vhdx. That file is going to represent the hard drive of our virtual machine. And it is going to be a dynamically expanding disk that is up to 128 gigs, which is way bigger than we need, but we'll let it stretch that big if it wants to. And in terms of installing an operating system, we will do that later. Click on Finish. And our virtual machine is here. If we go to the settings for our virtual machine, one of the quirks when you set up a Generation 2 virtual machine is it does not give you a virtual DVD drive by default. So I'm going to go to the SCSI controller here, which is what our storage devices hook up to, and I am going to select DVD drive, and I'm going to add that DVD drive. And the other thing I'm going to do with that DVD drive is I'm going to put my virtual DVD inside it. So I'm going to pick image file, and on the D drive in that ISO folder is where I've got those images. So I've got one named Windows 10 Enterprise and another Windows 2016. So that's my server operating system. I'll select that one. And this virtual machine, believe it or not, is good to go. So that's all there is to it. So you would do a similar process for each of your 2 client computers.